Okay, so let me start by saying that it is a pleasure for me to be here and to have this opportunity to engage with your work, which I didn't have come across before, but now I did, and even so that I'm really looking forward to also your next book, and we might talk about that later. But so first we're going to talk about Inferior, and actually I wanted to raise some fairly general questions. The first one being, I learned that you decided for this book, or maybe was stumbled over it, as it were, because of a surprise that you had when you had to write an article about, was it menopause?
Yeah, I'd read a lot of feminist literature before I started looking at this question for myself. And I have an engineering degree. When I was at school and when I was at university, I was often the only girl in the room or in the class. But all that time I didn't really think about why. And I think maybe I'd absorbed the stereotype that perhaps I was rare amongst women in liking these subjects, that most women didn't. And maybe in the back of my mind I thought maybe there was a biological difference there. I never really questioned that, which is a failure of myself not to question that. But a couple of years after I had my son, I'd just gone back to work, and the Observer newspaper in London asked me to write a story on the menopause. Which female science journalist can we think of? And so they gave it to me. Even though it's nothing to do with my area of expertise, like I said, I have an engineering degree, so I've always covered engineering stories. But it wasn't a very great theory, not just because it sounds sexist, that's one I think. Older men had not found older women attractive. So they had favoured younger women, so older women had somehow lost their fertility at some point. And the science behind it, there's no real mechanism for that, how that would happen. Theory doesn't explain how we lived long enough for that to happen. And in fact, there was already a really good hypothesis to explain the menopause, which was known as the grandmother hypothesis. Coincidentally, loads of women have worked on this one. They've worked on it for many years. It's got a lot of evidence behind it. And it is kind of the leading theory in this field. And the grandmother hypothesis says something completely different. It says that women live so long into their infertile years because grandmothers are so vital to the survival of their grandchildren. And we can see this mechanism play out. Studies have been done to show that the presence of a grandmother really does statistically increase the likelihood of the survival of her grandchildren. So that's a really good mechanism for how this could have happened, scientific mechanism. And what astounded me was not which was right or which was wrong, but that here are a group of men with their one theory, and here was a group of predominantly women with another theory, and each was very politically loaded. If science were objective, then you wouldn't have that, surely. Then you would just have one good theory and everyone would agree on it. So I looked at other areas of science in which these biases might happen, and what I wanted to figure out was not just what science says about women, but why do people believe these things? Why are they so invested in their theory being the right one? Why does it matter to them that for example, this patriarch hypothesis that men have the agency when it comes to menopause? Why does it matter to the women that the women have the agency when it comes to this question? And it does matter. Politics does affect science, our personal politics. It affects what we choose to research, what the theories are that we come up with, the speculation that we lay onto the theories. Sometimes it can even affect how we do an experiment and the outcome of that experiment. We think of empiricism as value-free. It's not always. If you have small biases, they can creep in to the structure of an experiment and affect the outcome.
But now it seems to me that you're making it into a kind of individualistic or personal sort of take on the issue, on a problem or something like that. Would you say it's that? Or
I don't think it's purely that, but I do think when we're studying human behaviour, that definitely comes into the mix. So there are some sciences in which the gender of the researcher may not matter, astrophysics or chemistry, or something. But if we're humans studying humans, and we have such vested kind of beliefs and ideas around the relationship between men and women, sex differences, then of course that's going to become an issue. And also the way we approach the study of human behaviour is often, the way scientists often do it is they run a study on a small group of people. Now, of course, humans live in very different cultures, and our cultures change radically over the course of many years. So to look at a small group of people in a particular culture in a particular pace and time doesn't really make much sense, because their behaviour will not be representative of the behaviour of all humans forever. But that, scientists are so wedded to the idea that there is something innately true about how we behave, and that they can find that truth, and maybe they can for some questions, but they also get things wrong because of that approach.
No, I think what I'm trying to get at is, so if only it was such a personal position, that mattered, then things might change radically and quickly. But then how come, things like, how does this sexism that is there in science, as well as other isms, so to speak, how does that relate to the structure or the way we do science, the way we research it and publish about it, speak about it? Would you say, where's the problem to be located, is my question.
I think the problem is never going to go away.
No.
We all have our own personal biases,
yes.
And as long as scientists pretend that they're not biased and that what they're doing is somehow completely objective and they know best, then we'll never really fix the problem. What we need, number one, is a more representative science. So for a long time, science has been male-dominated, so we've only had the prejudices of this very small, narrow group of people. We need the prejudices of everyone, women, men, of all backgrounds, class, race, everything, in order not to eradicate prejudice, because it will still be there in the individuals, but to at least come at questions with a different point of view, which is what women have done as they've entered the sciences. So a lot of the bad science that was done in the 19th century and early 20th centuries when it came to women, as women have come into the sciences, they've challenged that. That's not to say they're value-free, they have their own values, but it feels like a corrective because they were not listened to for all that time.
Sure. So that means then that although science produces all sorts of flawed ideas about the difference between men and women, so the kind of scientific sexism that you address in your book, it is also within science that the problem can be solved. Is that?
Yeah, within science, and maybe a different approach to science as well. One of the women who I highlight in the book is Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, who's an evolutionary biologist in California. Now, in the 1970s, she came from a very patriarchal kind of Texan oil family. She had to run away from home to marry the man that she wanted. It was that kind of controlled environment. And she didn't just turn to science for answers, she turned to history. So she looked at the history of female sexual repression. She looked at the Mesopotamians, the Assyrians. How was modesty affecting, in those very early days of human civilization, how was the idea of modesty and sexual control affecting how women behaved? And how had that carried on for thousands of years until the 1970s, when male biologists would look at women and say, this is innate, you are sexually different from men because this is innate. And she challenged that by saying, actually, women have been sexually controlled for thousands of years. And this is why it seems innate to you, but actually it's a product of thousands of years of patriarchy. So it wasn't just science that gave her that answer, it was history, it was culture, and it was feminism.
So that means then it is not a matter of diversifying science as it is, but bringing in other people to the table, so to speak.
Other ways of thinking.
But also other ways of thinking, which will obviously also implicate the methods that are being used, but also how to frame the topic. Like in the example that you gave us before about motherhood and the menopause, In the one case, the issue is sexual reproduction and evolution and survival. In the other case, it is care and survival, right? So, which is a totally different topic, I would say, and allows you to intervene in different ways.
And I'm sure you've seen it yourself in your own field, that anthropology and the biological sciences have sometimes, split, sometimes come together, sometimes split again. But there's this feeling that somehow they're not compatible, that they're looking at things in completely different ways. And they're looking at different answers. They're looking at the same thing. But because the cultures are so different, it feels as though the answers can't come together. The answers can come together. But science needs to make a move towards understanding that these aren't just purely biological questions here. This is a question about culture as much as about anything else.
Yeah. Although I wonder whether, there is of course this idea that an idea of universality, right? That is the goal in science. You want to produce universal truth and solve the kind of problems in a kind of univocal way. So I think within feminism, but also critical theories, it has more and more become evident that there might be different kinds of truth working, and these different kinds of truth may not be cannot be mapped onto each other that easily. Sometimes there will be friction or clashes, or so what is a truth for a scientific setting and allows you to do certain kind of things may not be as truthful elsewhere because you have different kind of problem. You want to care for your grandchildren, right? You're not interested in many hormones you need to sustain humanity or something like that. So
but that's a really difficult thing for scientists to accept.
Yes, and I think that is the kind of challenge that we have to face. How to do that well? Yeah. Would you consider that also a feminist politics?
I do. I think feminists for a long time have steered clear of biological determinism, biology generally, because of biological determinism. There's this fear that, and it's a real fear because it has really been used against feminists. So, for example, Darwin wrote that women were intellectually inferior to men. And this has a real consequence on how women are treated in society, because if Darwin, a genius like Darwin, can say that in the 1880s or 1870s, then in the 1900s, when women are fighting for the vote, that makes their life so much harder. There was a reproductive biologist called Walter Heape. He was, in the early 20th century, the leading reproductive biologist in the world. He wrote an entire book arguing that women fighting for the vote were wasting their reproductive energy, that they would be better off at home having children and raising their children than going out and campaigning, that was not their job, and that they were actually denying their biology. So feminists have every reason to fear science, because when you've had science like that pushing these kind of half-truths or false ideas about them, these biologically determinist ideas that say that you are not designed for this, you can't do this because you're not built for it, then you become fearful of that system of thinking. But what I wanted to do with this book was show that actually science is on the side of feminism, and those facts are actually very empowering. The true story, once we start to challenge these old orthodoxies, is actually incredibly empowering. And it's been empowering to me in my own life.
Could you take an example? That's one.
So, like I was saying before, when I was growing up, I think I kind of absorbed subconsciously this idea that maybe women weren't as good at maths or weren't as good at science, and that's why I was the rarity in my classrooms and at university. Writing this book, I've realised actually there's so psychological and cognitive differences between men and women, studies have shown, are either minimal or non-existent. So how has this imbalance come about? There are so many other explanations for how it's come about, and when you understand the politics behind that, it makes you really angry, because you realise then how women have been cheated for thousands of years of their talents, that the society has been cheated of the talents of all these women. And that had a profound effect on me. It really made me think about the world differently. I see the injustice in a new way because of the scientific facts.
Yeah, and which I can completely relate to, and I think also your book is in many ways refreshing, and you have various novel examples. For me, I really marveled at certain moments where you were in archives or in conversation with certain scientists. But at the same time, you're here in this huge library and the archive downstairs. A lot of work has been done already in this field. So how come this message does not come across? How come it's not so widely? And at the same time, how come your book actually is now? So it's a double question. Do you think it's just a momentary attention, or
I don't. Well, a lot of the work that's been done in this area has tended to come from the social sciences. Mm-hmm. So scientists don't read it. Scientists just don't care because they think it's not for them. I wrote this book not having a view on either side. Mm-hmm. Purely I wanted to know the facts, and I was quite prepared for the possibility that I wouldn't like the facts. And there were some cases in which I didn't like the facts. The Walter Heap and Darwin arguments that were made in the first wave of feminism are being made in a new way now by the far right and the alt-right, and some mainstream people who still claim equality is impossible because biologically it's not built into our nature. Yeah. And we need the science to counter that, because they will keep beating that drum. They won't listen to anything else. Mm-hmm. They will only listen to scientific facts because they are using scientific facts to beat us with. There was this memo written by a Google engineer that became quite famous. So there was an engineer at Google, a young guy in his early 20s, and he released this memo to his company saying that they should stop their affirmative action and equality policies because the reason that there weren't so many women in Silicon Valley is because women just weren't quite as good at those kind of jobs. And he got fired at the end of it. I wrote lots of op-eds at that time. I really hope we get through to people, because I didn't just write this book for women, I wrote it for people like him. Yeah.
So I have two questions. I'm looking at the chair that I would like to ask. The first one is has to do with something that dawned to me really very recently. Like, I had my moments of when having young students and go read a book, for God's sake, before we have this conversation again. And slowly but surely I came to realize, like, by God, we are so educated in academia. We're told everything has to be frontier and excellent and new and innovative. But lots of the work that we have to do is work of maintenance, of telling the story again and again and again and again. And I had to think about this also while reading your book. So part of it is absolutely in line with what I have read already in modern feminist studies and other kinds of literature. And as I said, part of it is also new and sparkling, also for me new, although I have been in the field for quite some time. So do you agree that our work is work of care and just doing it again and again?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it is. And there's actually a lot of my book is going over the work that was done in the 70s. Yeah. So you would think that it would be part of mainstream scientific thinking. What's shocking is that it's not. Yeah. And actually one of the things I learned about why it's not is because mainstream scientists, and especially the scientists who are having the male scientists who are having their theories challenged, don't read it. And if they don't read it, then nothing will change, because their theories won't change. Theories become accepted over a very long period of time because of promotion, because there are people out there who are willing to talk about them, write about them, cite them.
In producing a kind of universal construct of the dichotomy between men and women, right? So they have them, men are like this and women are like that. It is sort of chilling, or at least problematic, that most of the medical research has been, indeed, as you write, conducted on the man or male model, whether it is a mouse or a man, it doesn't matter that much, so to speak. So this kind of biases that are there in science and that we need to appreciate as well, and the effects of medication that you write about. So here we are, on the one hand saying, well, it is really a construction, this kind of universal differences between men and women. But we would like you to choose women for this specific research, because the issue is much more an issue for women. Yeah. And I have the same problems even more, and this maybe hooks into your forthcoming book that I really look forward to read as well. In the Netherlands, we have an ongoing debate, maybe now for 20 years. Should we, and this is different from the UK, not introduce the registration of ethnicity as precisely for medical purposes, precisely for healthcare purposes? Because if we know where the people are from, we can provide better healthcare. And I think continental Europe has a different take on ethnic classification than the UK and the US. So there is this problem again. Are we not naturalizing, racializing even differences by introducing these kind of categories, if only in databases, so to speak? So what to do here? How do we deal with this construct of difference, right, that tend to be universalized and solidified, and at the same time, how can we still do diversity?
See, I think there are differences on average between men and women physically and in health terms. So the obvious ones, height, average, like you say. So there will be many women who are taller than some men. There will be many women who have more upper body strength than some men. So this isn't a bucket approach. It's not that all women are like this and all men are like this. Now, on average, for example, in presentation of stroke and heart attack symptoms, women on average present a little bit differently from men. That's something we've only realised recently, and GPs are kind of coming to grips with that. There are some illnesses that will only affect women because we have different reproductive systems. We give birth and men don't give birth. So there are some issues that only women will face. So in that sense, sex does matter then medically, because a man will never present with period pain. So there's no value in kind of ignoring that. And we have to recognise women's illnesses when they are specific to women, because if we just only use the male model, for instance, then things get neglected. The question of race, I think, is a completely different one, because every country has different ways. It can be white, black and brown at the very same time. That's how nonsensical race is when it comes to categories. The direction in which science is going, and I think society also needs to go, is not thinking about these groups, whatever the groups are, gender or race. A rich black man in the US will not have the same life as a poor black man in the US. You can't treat them the same. The rich black man may have, a very similar high medical profile to a rich white man. So to treat people by race, I think, makes no sense whatsoever. If we think about people as individuals,
and you notice already also in your book that this is also the direction where it is heading, right? With genetics and the impact of the life sciences. That the promise is individualized medicine. It's more what we do is really sort of racialized medicine.
We're kind of a mosaic, this kind of tessellated pattern of interests and desires and wants and capabilities. And that's really, I think, the only way we can think about humans. There is no other way of thinking about us.
And I was wondering, maybe it's an opportunity that we're in the middle of a replication crisis, and that this is also, it's a bad thing, but it's an opportunity maybe also to look again at sloppy science. And what do you think about it?
And she looked at these old studies to do with sexual selection. So this is Darwin's theory that males and females in general, not of every species but of many species, the male is naturally promiscuous. He bore this out. He showed that the males mated with more females, and the females tended to either not mate at all or just mate with a couple of fruit flies. And for 50 years or more, 60, 70 years, that became a paradigm. That was kind of the model for all humans, or for all species, all sexual behaviour everywhere in the world.
It is really a puzzle. Why is it that critical theories, whether feminist, anti-racist, post-colonial, decolonial, do not become more relevant in the social sciences and humanity. I mean, I think we should be ashamed of ourselves. I mean, something is going wrong, and it obviously has to do with structures and structural racism and sexism that is going on. That translates not only to the people, but also how we do our teaching and research. But still, at least there is some corners where things are happening, but it is quite different in the natural sciences. And it got worse, because I used to teach actually at the Faculty of the Sciences, and I taught 2 masters across the board, so from math to biology and physics, everybody was there. And that was the first occasion for students to engage with social science theory, to understand that we have a law, legislation that regulates the stuff, to understand that there's politics involved, that feminism and all these issues are there. And although the slogan is interdisciplinarity and innovations, and interdisciplinarity will lead the way, what has happened in the past 10-15 years is a monodisciplinary approach and a fierce fight between disciplines. We need more money, we want more students, and so we are teaching generations that are very solipsistic, only focusing on their own little thing, and something really needs to happen there. I mean, if there is something that we need to tell our university boards, is to start with philosophy of science, history of science classes, critical theory sometimes during the bachelor in the bachelor education. It is really vital. Otherwise, and they get lots of money.
Can I ask a follow-up? But also I have a PhD in communication, where several specializations really don't talk to each other at all. My question is, specialization a cause here, maybe?
We need to innovate ourselves, to reinvent ourselves, to reinvent our subject matters, and which interdisciplinary path to follow. And you cannot do this when you are so spread about and you water down your capacity, intellectual capacity. So I really I'm very much in favor of having a niche where you can develop, and from there also reach out to work together with other disciplines and colleagues. And at the same time, I mean, there's lots of knowledge. We have these libraries, we have this enormous wealth of visions and ideas about the world and politics that we need to share in as broad as possible.
Of course, yesterday was the International Women's Day, and I was inside a lot of universities at a lot of events. And the question that was raised is there like a momentum for women in science? And I want to put into context, because there are 2 things. Like, at the one hand, in the Netherlands, there's the Westerdijkjaar, so there are 100 female professors extra installed. Yeah, I also wanted to propose the question to both of you: is there like a momentum for women in science, or is it just maybe like a hype or something? And
you have these big, important male professors, junior women, who often have no choice. If you want to work in one specific discipline, there may only be that one man who can control your career, and you're at his mercy for the rest of your life. And if he doesn't like you, or if he is harassing you, or worse, that's it. There is nothing for you anymore. And there are many women in those situations who are still unable to speak up because their careers are on the line. So to that extent, science does need its big kind of Weinstein moment, or its big Me Too moment, to have fundamental change from the ground up. And I hope it happens. I do feel like there is this groundswell. I've seen hundreds and hundreds of women come out and come to networking events. I organised an event last month in London at one of our scientific organisations to get all these women together. I got all the learned scientific societies together and said, let's get behind this, let's create a network for women where we can talk about these issues, we can work together in the same way that men have created by default institutions for themselves, like the Royal Society, all the societies, all the scientific societies have excluded women for hundreds of years. Now why can't women create their own societies and push back at that, or take over the society?
Well, I recognize what you're saying, because
we write a lot about the sexual harassment. When I use the argument something to do with Me Too, it's like, yeah, you're gonna go into default modus and you're complaining and blah blah blah. But I really feel like that science is one of the fields in our society that are it's so almost medieval, like the connection you have with your promoter and everything. That it's
really horrible. I mean, I can imagine there's many women who don't want to work in that. It takes a lot of strength and a lot of bravery to be those first women to stand up. In the US, it's already happened. We've seen cases like Lawrence Krauss, that physicist recently. A number in astrophysics have come about. But again, these women are going to suffer in their careers because of what they've done. There's no doubt. They may not have careers left at the end of it, sadly. They may have to start again, and that's the price they pay. It's so difficult, but we need to create networks that will support them and make it okay for any woman who wants to say anything to come out and change the kind of basic culture. One thing I have learned over the last year, I've had a lot of support from women scientists for this book. They've come together in the most incredible ways, and they have taught me how much I need to support the women in my life. I work really hard to elevate the women in my life, the friends that I have, and any women in my circle. If, someone asks me to be on TV, I can't do it, I push one of them to do it. If I have to, any opportunity that comes along, I push one of the women in my network to do that. And we need to do that more, work with each other, help each other, support each other, elevate each other's ideas, because men have done that for thousands of years. And we need to be doing that too.
I'm very happy that you're here, and thank you to Atria and your publisher for hosting us. I've one question, and it's really back to, because I would love to talk about the momentum, etc. But this is really back to what's in the book and something that I missed in it, and I was really looking for your answer. Is that in a lot of conversations that I have when it comes to diversity in careers and how to promote women to higher levels, also in science, is that people at some point will say, but don't you believe in differences? There are differences, right? That's why we find each other so attractive. So there's this notion of this innate difference between men and women that people then tend to explain as a cause for differences in, for instance, career progress. How do you play that game if that answer is given to you?
So you mean the idea of positive differences?
Yeah, well, that is so nice that we're not actually the same.
That is just as damaging as saying men are more intelligent, and that's why they're in this field. This idea that there are some positive qualities and we should embrace them about women that also make us innately different is not progress, in my opinion. Men can be just as empathic as women. This is also a cultural construct. This idea that men don't make good enough fathers, for instance, parents, or that they don't have the same language skills. Research doesn't bear that out. So I don't embrace these positive differences any more than I embrace the negative ones. We are different as individuals. I, for example, have... my husband is a very empathic person. I'm not the most empathic person. I have difficulty showing him the amount of sympathy he shows me when we have problems. So, in our personal lives, we are all different in very individual ways. And I think that's the kind of thing we need to understand. End this kind of grouping in whichever way you want to do it, because it doesn't do anybody any favours. Like I said before, we're a mix of different features, masculinity and femininity, or constructs, in which case you get into deep, this is the world of social science where you belong to, you get into deeper and deeper layers of it getting more and more complicated. So as a journalist, really, I'm just covering the top layer. I'm not going any deeper than that, because that is the most basic way in which the scientists look at it, and the most basic way in which society looks at it. It's not fair. It doesn't do justice to the topic. I haven't done justice to the reality, because I'm limited by how much I can say in those 200 or 300 pages. And like you, I do feel uncomfortable sometimes when I see how polarised the battles are, because that's not the reality of how we live. Of course, there are many men who are victims of harassment and victimisation. They should feel included in that. And it's really hard.
So there are moments where even though we know our identities are fluid and there are differences, there are lots of nuances. The world is not in black and white. It doesn't come in these colors, so to speak, or in pink and blue for that matter. There are we have to assume this identity in order to question something really loud and to put something on the agenda. So and maybe to tie your question with the previous question about. But there are differences. Yes, there are differences, but these are the differences that we make. Many of these differences are not just a matter of a view on reality. Many of these differences are really sedimented in our structures, in our educations, in our language. So they have hardened in a sense, right? These are the kind of differences that are not that fluid. And we do lots of maintenance work to keep these differences there. And to say, well, this is how we order the world. Sometimes it's really nice to have that. Maybe most of the times, otherwise we would go crazy because every day you have to figure out, like, where are the lines, so to speak. No, they are already for us there, and we can make use of them, and they become part of who we are. At the same time, these structures of the world that we live in are, thank God, not completely totalizing, in the sense that they don't leave any room for maneuvers. So that means that we are messing up these structures as well. We mess up the language, we introduce foreign words and or different accents. We mess up the structures by, making a screw here a bit looser or get rid of it. And this is what we do. And it is there that there is lots of possibilities for change. That we create these possibilities for better or for worse. I mean, that's not to say that this is a good thing. So, and I think, but we tend to neglect that. So we tend to neglect the situations. So this is the hard work that we are doing. Like, identities are not fixed, they're fluid, and look here, biology does not add up because I can biologize us based on genes and make a certain difference between us and maybe 2 or 3 clusters, and then I go to hair color and then the clusters are messed up. You can see the differences and you have then 1, 2, 3 clusters. But this is a mediated kind of seeing based on looking, right? So if I get my microscope here, I will see differently, and then the 3 groups do not hold anymore. And it is that kind of practices that we do all the time that is there that we need to articulate. And this is the political work that is needed. So we live by the structures, and this is important for us because it keeps us sane and maybe provides us for, we can do our work without thinking too much about the thing. But there's also a lot more going on that is trivialized, othered, not articulated, that needs some extra attention. This is the work of care that I mentioned earlier. How to do that well, I don't know, but maybe we need that revolution. When you have problems with your lungs, and this is not, and a doctor would tell you, well, that's the cultural differences, I'm afraid. And you think, what? Bad doctor. So you need to be medicalized, biologized, made into a body that has a problem, right? So, and I think this is why it is important to engage with the sciences, why it is important to bring in biology in its diversity and variety, because the fact that your lung makes you fall into an epidemiological group of young women that have, does not mean that when we look at your kidney, you're still in that group, because you will be elsewhere, because, I don't know. So this is why this cultural argument and only say that everything is social construction is not enough. Sometimes it is helpful, but it's really not enough.
Yeah, and it's the culture you're protesting against, really. You're saying, I want a cultural change because the culture has created these inequalities. The culture has made me who I am, and you can't stop being that person. You will always be that person, but the culture is also the problem, which is we're fighting against ourselves in that sense.
Reach really big audience, you have to in a way adapt the same strategies as the counterparts are taking. So what you were saying, you have to give up a part of the nuance maybe, and that's always an internal dilemma, I think.
And that was, like you said, there's a lot of social science written critiquing feminist critiques of science, but it has the language of social science, which is completely alien to science. they will not understand half the words in a Donna Haraway paper, sadly.
No.
Look at how scientifically flawed the studies are. Not the language around it, not the culture around it, not the kind of loaded ways. Did you do this control? Did you actually get the results that you wanted? In what way was this published? Why was it published? Who was funding you? Because that is a language that science understands. It can respond to that. That's what I'm saying.
Even though it's a brilliant,
even though it's a brilliant and necessary thing, scientists won't read it, and even if they do read it, they won't necessarily relate to it.
Yeah, but I'm just saying those are not two separate things.
They're not.
No,
They're not. No.
Yeah, they're not two separate things. It's the same thing. It's just about altering the way you do it. That's all.
Distributing knowledge.
Yeah.
On that note, I'd like to thank you for the wonderful interview, Madam Chavik and Saini.